Hello and welcome to Pedestrian Space Roundtable featuring Blair Lorenzo, a featured correspondent from the Global Walkability Correspondence Network. Blair is based in New York and is a professional urbanist and writer who is dedicated to exploring how American cities work through critical analysis of urban spaces, places, and systems. Her handle on Instagram is Fox and City, correct? Fox and City. Great work. I'm so happy to be acquainted with Blair, first of all, and then also to have been able to welcome her into the Correspondence Network as the American Urbanism Correspondent, sharing her expertise and interest. Really looking forward to this roundtable today. Blair will be presenting, and then as a network facilitator herself of another network, a skilled moderator. So she will also be handling the Q&A. Thank you, Blair. I am turning it over to you.
Thank you, Annika. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to be here too. And there we go. I'm not going to do the standard Zoom thing of asking that everyone can see my screen, but that's, uh, let me go. So hello, everyone. Annika, gave a pretty good introduction and, you know, I'm a writer and urbanist, and I've studied cities and what makes them work for most of my adult life. Um, and I'm just going to get right into it. I'll say this: most of my work is rooted in American cities, but I think a lot of it is applicable and interesting in a lot of ways. Mm, Anyway, um, you know, uh, this was especially true before the pandemic, but even true now. Urban places are really, hot and popular right now, especially in the United States, but it's true worldwide. You look around and, you know, in the center of places in every city and every town in this country, not every, unfortunately, but most, there's a return to this. Neighborhoods that for generations couldn't get investment are now full of boutiques and restaurants. Uh, Indeed, the biggest cities in the United States, places like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Boston, uh, are so popular all of a sudden and so functional that they risk having the wealthy price everyone else out. This is such a huge shift, in narrative because, for two generations, the United States was focused on this suburban narrative, on this narrative that, we wanted the picturesque single family house, behind a white picket fence. We wanted to have a separate piece of land that was our own. We wanted space. We wanted the freedom of the automobile, the ability to go wherever, anytime. And of course, America has this long history of anti-urban politics. Um, all the way back to the founding of the country, if not before, that the city is the root of all evil, that, it is a place of crime and danger and dirt. And this, especially in the 20th century, got, infused with even more ugly racial politics and the like. And you know through subsidy and everything else, the actual cores of American cities tended to empty out into these suburban areas. And this is a huge reversal that we're now seeing. And of course, this reversal is not, and it's not just a reversal, but this change towards the urban is not simply an American phenomenon, as I'm sure everyone here knows. Cities across the world are exploding. You know, the famous UN report that now more than half the world lives in cities. I saw a great thing that greater than half the world population right now lives in about 3% of the world's area. Um, the world is urbanizing, and there's good things to say about this. With the this sort of previous model of auto-centric mobility in the developed Western world, you know, led to so many problems. Spatial segregation between race, class, gender, women stuck at home, not able to move and isolated in space. Uh, Spatial alienation, where people are separated from one another, and even more fundamental issues. As climate change comes in, both spatially and ecologically. not everyone in the world can rely on cars as a mobility thing. That would be absolutely disastrous. Um, and I even look at this group, the ability, celebrating the ability of people to walk, to travel on their own with dignity, and to recognize something that in a lot of places we've lost, but something we can have. And, kind of when I come down to talking about this, uh, I like to say that, walkability is a vital part of this, but it is not the only factor. Um, but a lot of this kind of puts the horse before the cart. We know intuitively what we want, but we have trouble putting it into words. Urbanity itself is actually a quite poorly theorized concept. Um, I always like to ask, what comes to mind when I bring up the word urban? What comes to mind when you think I ask you to imagine an urban place? Is it groups of people walking on a shopping street? Are they busy buildings, tall buildings, parks full of people? Is it a bus or a train full of transit? Is it people mixing? Um, you know, unplanned interactions, unplanned encounters? And if you start to ask people this question, you start to get a real sense that people have this intuitive sense of what urban means. So does that mean that urbanity is just a checklist of items? Well, I always go back and I consider Houston, the fourth largest city in the United States now, or in terms of metro area. And, you know, if you drew a 30 or even better, a 60 miles circle around the center of Houston, you'd see, 8 million people, you'd see this huge economy, cultural institutions, amenities, people of all races, genders, classes, economic statuses, uh, you know, sports teams, all the things you associate with a city. At the same time, if you take a slice out of Houston and looked at it and showed it to most people, I think they'd say, well, that's not look like a city. I mean, it's dense, but it's very auto-centric and it's full of single family detached houses and shopping malls and everything. Um, I mean, any definition of a city that didn't include Houston, I think we could all agree is kind of a bit out there. Houston functions, but does it function well? Does it function the way we want it to? Consider the comparative of a small town. The American small town is sort of something I always go to, but it's true of certainly European and Asian. I'm only so well traveled, but we have the kind of core there where there is a street, there are shops, it's walkable, it's dense, there are people on the street. This is Zionsville, Indiana, a tiny town of 30,000 people. Um, but you sometimes see it in even smaller towns. You could have a town of 1,000 people that will have this little core that is that. And you say, well, this is obviously not a city. This is homogeneous. The people tend to all know each other. It's tiny, but it also um, it has this feeling. It has this function. And so, there's a famous Supreme Court case by Chief Justice Potter Stewart around pornography, where he said, I can't define what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. And in some ways, urbanity feels like that. It's not an either or category. It's a matter of gradations. Sort of the more elements of urban life and urban existence you have, the more urban it is. The problem, of course, when you try to actually hit down to what is an urban space, is so much ink has been spilled. There's so much writing and talk about urban places, but almost all of it comes from the point of view of what is a good urban space. That's a vital question, but you know, also then what is sufficient to be urban? Not just what is ideal, what is sufficient? And it's hard, and it's a hard thing to define. I always start with the importance of the public realm, and this is from Lynn Laughlin, a urban sociologist who wrote this great book called The Public Realm. And She fundamentally says that the public realm is the city's quintessential social territory. Urban life is a life lived in public to a large degree. Um, you know, yes, you go to private spaces, you live in a private space, usually and but you spend so much more percentage of your time on a street, in a restaurant, in a train or a bus, places with other people. And this creates all sorts of unplanned interactions, and uh, which is really the key that I want to get to. That urban spaces allow the sort of unplanned, unstructured, or if they are structured, they're very loosely structured interactions that allow cities to become what they are, that allow them to work so great. And this nature of the public realm is actually quite rare in the United States, where are we have so little public space. Everything is full of very privatized environments. So I've been, my all my work centers around what is urbanity, and um, how do we generate it? How do we preserve it? How do we appreciate it? And I have this working definition that is rooted in the U.S. context, in the U.S. narrative history, uh, based around four characteristics. Um, I want to be clear up front. I'm trying not to be a chauvinist here. This is perhaps not the only way to do things, but I do believe this has wider use. And I do believe that this is a pattern that works. And it's a great framework to analyze any space, uh, city or not, to see how it works. So without any further ado, let's get into it. The first of my four characteristics, and the first two are the more obvious ones, but the first one is function. Um, it- you know, an urban place has to have a certain amount of relative density. As we saw with the small town example, it doesn't necessarily need to be Manhattan or San Francisco as here in density, but a relative density of people, and not just people, but activities, people doing things, people moving around. Urban spaces have to mix uses. You mix social, cultural, and economic activities together. They're not kept separate and never interact. Indeed, their interaction is exactly what makes this special. There are, what I always like to say, a variety of different people doing different things. And sometimes they interact and sometimes they don't, and that's what makes it special. It's an environment that maximizes the unplanned interactions that make urban life work. Eh, you know Fundamentally, cities are an emergent phenomenon. They come from different people doing different things, and they form systems that take on a life of their own and are greater than them. And an urban space should blend functions together so as to enable those emergent systems in good ways. They should encourage socioeconomic mixing. They should be generative of social and cultural structures. They should increase, even just on a pure practical level, they make the simple nature of living easier, distribution of goods, being able to travel much more easy and possible. And this is something we see a lot threatened with things like single-use zoning, where we say, okay, the people live here, but there's going to be no shops, and the shops are going to be here, and the businesses are going to be here, and they're never going to interact. And that is a fundamentally deadening thing. We see it especially with spaces designed for cars. Cars are huge. They take up a lot of space and they push everything further apart. And that really interferes with the intermixing. And finally, you see it also with dead zones, spaces people don't want to go in. If you have a large zone of very little going on, it really inhibits this functional mixing. Of course, there's a little more. There's also physicality. And I think this is the one that's most easiest for people to understand. This is about creating spaces that support the above function, and not just the function, but support the people who live in it. Um, this is the core of walkability. This is what makes, a space makes it not only that we are able to walk places or, uh, go on push a wheelchair places or however we get around, that we have places we can understand and travel through and essentially uh, that support this interconnected public realm. And the key to physicality is um, is the human scale. Urban space lives or dies on our embodied experience. It is as much about the people uh, in space. If we cannot, if we have buildings that we cannot interact with, that don't meet our physical needs, and then just as importantly, don't meet our psychological needs, our psychological expectations to make us comfortable in space, to make us want to move through space, uh, it doesn't work. The example I always go to for something like this is, you know, blank walls. A blank brick wall, you could have 100-meter blank brick wall, and people will rank that as taking much longer to walk across than it actually does. Whereas if you have 100 meters of shops or of dense buildings, you know, people are not just willing to walk; they rate it as being less long than it is. Um, this is also an issue of speed, of designing and building for people moving at human pace, not for people driving at 50 kilometers an hour, not for, or 90 or 100. Um, it's for the details you see and all of that. It's not necessarily aesthetics. You see a lot of this. People get into wars and fights. Is this too restrictive? Is this prescriptive of a certain style? Aesthetics can be important. Spaces people like and work, are a thing, but it's a dangerous thing. I tend to take a very functionalist approach to it. Is if it is supporting human people, it's working. Obviously, autocentric land use is terrible. Parking lots and huge distances are anathema to the human scale. Segregated land uses are the same thing. And, accessibility can be an issue. Uh, you know, uh, Especially for the core of this group, you know, places that don't have a sidewalk, or if they do, it's such an afterthought. It's just full of dehumanizing scale and incomprehensible spaces and blank walls that it's unpleasant and you wouldn't want to get around it even when you can. So these first two things, function and physicality are pretty standard, but when you really point down to it, they're kind of incomplete. You have to ask the question, is a standard suburban shopping mall something that is dying here in the US, but was huge for a long time, urban? Um, uh, the Viennese American architect Victor Gruen is on the right there is the father of the American shopping mall. And he created these places explicitly to look and operate like the shopping streets in his hometown of Vienna. Uh, he wanted to have this concentration of people and shops. He wanted to have this concentration of activity. Um, he imagined eventually that malls would have housing there right next to them, that they would have cultural and governmental functions in them. And, to some extent that simply didn't happen. But, I think most people who have been in the shopping mall can say, yeah, this is nice. This gets a lot of it, but there's also a lot lacking here. This is a private space. This is the consumptive space. This is, um, i- urban space is more than just these visceral, physical aspects. There's more to it. So I then go on to say, to the two more esoteric factors. The third one is, urban space has an economic function. Uh, Fundamentally, cities are in some ways the product of agglomeration economies. That means, you know, the more things and people and ideas you have together, the more they interact, the easier it is for new activities and ideas to arise. And it supports those. It supports ones that couldn't exist otherwise. And fundamentally, urban places should support and nurture this type of economic interaction. They should allow new enterprises to try their hand, and they have to support them via a web of connections. A huge, um, you know, uh, a huge company can settle anywhere. They do everything in-house. A small firm just starting off, they may need, independent suppliers, independent producers, all these things, and they need to be supported in space. Um, and the economic thing, it can't just be tied to this. It has to uplift people. It has to support the people of the city. It has to generate new business and new things in the city. And I want to be clear, I'm talking about the economy broadly speaking, you know, uh, forgetting the 100% the modern Western, you know, uh, privatized capital. This also applies to all sorts of productive sociocultural economic organization. Fundamentally, urban intermixing is the engine that generates social, cultural, and economic change and development. And this is something we see threatened all the time with, rising rents, lack of uh, uh, flexible tenancy systems, places that are too big. They cannot support everybody in a place. You know, if you ban vending, you have you have banned the street vending. You often end up banning the poorest from the joining and working in the city economy. Inequity is a huge issue. When you have this type of economic growth really does depend in a large part on a relatively level playing field to be equitable. And the more inequitable it is, it breaks the system. There's both issues of over and under regulation. If you're highly regulating space like the above vendors, you leave people out. If you under regulate it, you have a laissez-faire economy, and we all know the problems that come with this. There's also issues of ownership and control, and important. And as I say, it is the easiest one to miss. Um, in fact, I'm gonna uh, with Annika being back, I'm going to just repeat that just for the recording. But um, that the fourth and final thing is political belonging and political ownership. you know that this is the hardest one to encapsulate, and it mirrors questions of what it's mean to be a citizen. It's a contested, deeply qualitative experience. Um, and this is where malls fall down. For instance, they're owned by a private owner. They're a private space, and you don't own it. This kind of breaks down to two major parts. And the first is just ability. Can you inhabit the space freely? Can you move without fear? Can you do different things in it? As we've seen around the world, if you are not allowed to inhabit space, is it really yours? You know, it's a great question I always ask when looking at a space, which is, can you protest here? It's not to say protest is the nuclear ultra of urban space, but it can be a revealing question. And the second is ownership. And by ownership, I don't just mean economic, I mean psychosocial. I mean, you know, can you feel at home in a place? Can you make it part of yourself? If you're in it every day, does it become a part of you? Does it give you opportunity, safety, belonging? Do you feel comfortable here enough to express yourself, to exercise freedom? Is this a space that people identify with, that they want to be a part of? And obviously, these are difficult issues. They come down to questions of control. Who's in control? How much power do they exercise? Is it a light touch or a heavy touch? There are issues of safety, and safety puts the freedom and rights of one group against another a lot of the time. you know so what can be done while enabling others to not be done unto yourself? um, what can be, but also that allows people to do as much as they want. And we also have issues of uh, control and bottom up versus top down. you know um, Obviously, I think the excesses and issues of top-down space are the biggest, are easiest to understand. But bottom-up space can be just the same if it doesn't provide the exact type of space that we talk about. Anyway, I think these four categories, function, physicality, economics, and political ownership, really put together a decent conception of what we mean when we say urban. So how do we put this to use? What good is this? Well, on one hand, it's just something simple and easy to keep in mind. This is a pattern that works. It helps avoid the common pitfalls we've seen with all sorts of urban interventions across the world, um, where we break these things and we try to replace them with things that more often than not simply don't work. These four things are a framework to analyze a space. They're good to say, well, is this space working? Is it functioning in an urban way? Um, it's a great tool to help us identify what and where we want to preserve, what we want to build, and how we want to manage it, how we want to sustain and appreciate urban places. One of the reasons I think this concept of urbanity is so important is that when we are working on any issue in a city, social equity, economics, architecture, traffic control, and any of these things, these are very important, but ultimately specialized things. And it's so easy to lose sight of the whole. And I think it is always important to come back and look at things holistically. And it's good to always remember, fundamentally, what we are looking to build and, what type of city and function we want to encourage. And I'll close with a final thought. Cities are some of, if not the most complex things that humans have ever built. They encompass every field of the human experience. Everything goes into them. No one person and no one field of study can ever fully encompass what cities are. And I think it's very important to always try to be humble and to recognize our interconnectedness and recognize the sheer scale of the systems we're dealing with just on a complexity level. And that this idea of urbanity is just one frame to use, but I also think it's a deeply useful one that helps us support cities as complex entities and support the emergent functions that come out of them. Anyway, wanted to say, thanks for listening, and I want to, open the field for questions, and maybe we can try to get a discussion. Is this useful to you? Is this interesting? I love to hear different thoughts of people in different places around the world, and does do these categories seem true to your experience? Are things missing? So thank you, and you know, uh, love if someone wants to either jump in or ask a question or whatever you'd like.
Hey Blair, Gautam here.
Hey, Gautam.
I think a lot of what you said resonated a lot for me. It made a lot of sense, even though I've never lived in New York. I think it did really connect even with the Indian context and whatever I'm familiar with. And the things you said about just cities being emergent phenomenon, I don't know, maybe that's a very simple thought, but it just really hit me while you were talking about it, and it made a lot of sense. And the thing about the shopping mall, I don't know, I feel like I've always had some sort of an internal struggle with the idea that I like hanging out at malls because they are, as you say, they are intrinsically consumerist environments, and there's a limitation to what you can actually accidentally experience there. And just hearing you describe where that came from and what that form is trying to mimic, and hearing about what its limitations also are, again, just made a lot of sense to me, and it helped resolve that friction that I've had with myself about why do I like this, because it doesn't feel natural, it doesn't feel very uh, human, I guess, even though it is man-made essentially. So yeah, I mean, I loved the whole talk. Thank you so much for sharing it, and I certainly found it extremely eye-opening.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate that. And I think you're spot on with malls. I mean, it's easy to demonize malls because of the consumerist thing. I mean, they're kitschy, they're over the top. It's easy. It's almost overdone. We know it. They do hit on something. People like to be with other people. People want to be
Yeah,
in space.
exactly.
Exactly. You know, and indeed, um, I would never necessarily push, for malls to be the primary form of urban space, but there are ways to make them better. I talk a lot in my work about trying to turn um, big transportation hubs, train stations, that sort of thing into public spaces. And they're sort of mall-like in this regard, but they need to be done with a finer hand and being aware of these conceptions, being aware of, all right, if you're going to be the only landlord, you're going to have to, you know, uh, curate your stores. You're going to have to try to simulate an economy, and it's never going to be the same thing. You're going to have to try to have a loose handle of space and control. And, there are ways you can make spaces that are tremendously useful to people and tremendously helpful that, they may never be perfect, but they're really nice. And, there's a lot to learn there. Um, and to back up, yeah, that is the fundamental issue of cities and emergence. It's very easy to say, but I do think it's just the fundamental truth that is imperative to keep coming down to. Cities are emergent systems. They are immensely complex. And, we always have to be, they operate on different levels, and we always have to be very careful when we're discussing or operating on a different level to be aware of that, because we can have huge effects that we're not necessarily all have in our mind at once.
Hey, I have a follow-up question.
Go ahead.
So the thing about the owners of these spaces being conscious to the nuances, right, and the responsibility of what that space could possibly become. Um, do you think enabling that in that space is supposed to fall on the shoulders of people as activists or whatever, as people asking for it? Or is it supposed to be something that maybe rests in the hand of a designer or a planner who's supposed to understand those nuances and understand the potential there, and then bake it into the space by design? What do you think?
That's a great, great question. And I honestly think the answer is a little of both, which I know sounds like a bit of a cop out, because obviously the best design space that people are not interested in, um, not
Okay,
just
wait,
using.
I wanted to add one more sentence, because the
Go
reason I
for it.
asked the question, because I realized that, I mean, yeah, I don't know if that sounds like a fair question now that I've asked it, but the reason I ask is because sensitizing someone to the nuances of what a space can entail is itself, I would say that's rare, probably. It's rare for someone to
Mhm.
be able to know that, and then it's rare for someone to be able to receive that and feel as excited about it as the person who's giving them this information. And I'm sure that there is something called a status quo where there are a lot of owners of space who don't really, tend to that responsibility, who aren't really conscious to these things, and business still gets by, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering where this force of change to make sure that these people can become conscious to those things should probably come from. That's the context for my question.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I ideally think, this should be baked in from the beginning. I think it functions best when it's baked in from the beginning, when, a design is explicitly done to enable it. And when, because you see this a lot. It's something that comes to my mind. There are a lot of debates around space in cities. And this is far more than just mall spaces and things of that nature, where people center participatory democracy and planning, and that's great. That there's a lot to be said for that, and it obviously is nuanced and things. But a lot of times, you know, to somebody who comes to a place later, who wasn't part of that, which is always going to happen in cities, um, does it still work for their needs? Does it? Does that feel markedly different? Do they understand this stuff, which is what you're getting at? Um, and in that frame, it can be a little less important. It's still important, but it's a less important. to make sure that it's supporting the people in the framework. Um, I do think it's important to be baked in, but I think it's on a high management level because I don't know who else is going to do this. It'd be great to try to do, perhaps it could work as a widespread educational thing to uh, people who are running a space, whether that's as a business owner or as a anywhere in that stack. uh, you know, I, I'd be interested to see that, but I do, and obviously, the more input you have into it, the more likely you are to support the complex outcomes. It's very hard, if not impossible, for one person to be able to, or one small group to know everything that's going on and all the nuances of space, and it's very easy to get lost in a morass of your own issues and overlook things. Conversely, to actually set up a space to do this, it often helps to have someone or some people who are actively the ones doing it, whether it's the designers or planners or just managers. And that's why I really do think it's a bit of both. I think it helps that if everybody understands this all the way down. Um, at the same time, it's very, it if the it, fundamentally the natures of the way our spaces are done, if people aren't, if the people in charge aren't with it isn't going to happen, and if the people who create it isn't going to happen. um you know uh, eh, eh, and the last thing I'll say to this is I think physical design, it's obviously one of the things, one of the four categories. Physicality matters a lot, and having good bones to a space or a place, a shopping mall or something else, can really matter. Um, but a lot of times those that framework will not matter unless the management and population level, thing to use it is allowed to happen or is there. you know and a lot of times also spaces that are not great can kind of be retrofitted pretty easily to function great, maybe not as well as they would have otherwise, but um you know I always try to give design, especially physically design, its right place, which is to say it's not meaningless, not at all. In fact, it does a lot, but it also, it's only part and parcel.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. um other questions, comments, thoughts? Anyone else? I'd love to,
Hi, Lorenzo. Well, I'm not sure that I'm right or not, but I think that the core principle of this presentation is about collaborative urbanization and impose these four elements, economic and political belongings, so on. Uh, yeah, with people and urban planners, designer. I'm right. It's about collaborative urbanization.
Significantly, and a lot of times it's not explicitly collaborative. I hear collaborative organization and I think of, a real, very specific, we're going to set up a council and get everyone involved. And that's great, but that's not necessarily. This is what happens when you have what fundamentally happens in the city, people doing their thing, whatever there is, and they interact with one another and they interact with space, and they end up building these cities. They end up creating these collaborative structures, whether they're conscious of the fact that they're doing it or not. And it is those interactions that urban, everything that makes urban places great comes from the intensity, the generative aspect, the ideas. And, um, you know, eh, so that is the fundamental that you know, and it's great to have them in this sort of very open collaborative framework. But as we see, there are what I would consider very urban places and very top down, autocratic regimes in the world. Sort of the nature that you almost, unless you kill it, you cannot control this entirely. It's just the nature of people existing in space and interacting, and that is the fundam you know the fundamental truth. And when I get back to separating urbanity from other forms of physical existence, like suburban space and things like that, where they're separated. It's not that those places don't lurk. I go back to the Houston example. Houston is obviously a huge city. Lots of things happen. People do interact. People do it, but it comes at a tremendous ecological cost. And I think there's some good argument that it is missing a lot of these factors that can really help a city be a city on a human level.
Great. A follow-up question. I've been listening carefully and noticed that we all mention people, but what are those? For instance, if we say that Houston, are we gonna have have people and planners together and design a plan for specific spots? For Houston, it's about 8 million people. We cannot have all of them. So, which community we have to mention in our plans or have them to support us or to help us?
Yeah, isn't that the hardest question of urban governance, of of how to do it? Because yeah, fundamentally, direct democracy of 8 million people, I don't think I blow any minds to say that doesn't seem to work. That is very easy to fall apart. Um, you know, um, and I'll preface by saying, I find it interesting in work, but I am not a expert necessarily in governmental structures. And even when we talked about bringing stakeholders into a planning situation, there are those who say we need to directly reach out to everyone. There are those who say we should reach out to representative groups. There are those who say we don't need to do anything. The truth of the matter, though, I think, is that for someone involved in planning and in governance and in these direct things, trying to take frameworks like this and apply them through as wide an understanding as possible, to trying to get a real sense of what is happening on the ground with as many people as possible. Not just the type of people who are going to show up and talk, whether it's people who just want to complain, whether it's activists fighting for a righteous cause, whether it's, these people who make important, well, some of them make important points and others make loud points, but, a lot of times they make important points. But it's also important to be cognizant of the spaces and the things and the activities that happen on their own, of the people who don't necessarily, aren't necessarily talking, the people who are just trying to live their lives uh, and want their environment to support them and want their environment to help rather than hinder them. And so, you know, I think trying to incorporate them, it's where you get the idea of talking to people, not necessarily, to try to understand what they need, rather, what they actually need rather than what they think they need. And I know that sounds rather paternal, but I think you know, most people are not experts in urban space. And, uh, I hope that's helpful. I hope that answers what you're asking.
I hope so, but it sounds fair. Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Thanks.
of course. Questions, or even just, does this idea of urbanity resonate with you in your places?
Hi, it's Svi here. Can I add on to a little bit what you're saying? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So one of this is thank you very much. First of all, this is a very fascinating and stimulating conversation, and it's raising all kinds of questions in my head. I think I want to talk specifically to mixity, the point that you began with, and I think one of our challenges is essentially since the 20th century, the car domination has like radically changed the way we build cities and structure our lives. And that has had a profound impact. And ironically, I think your definition in a way harks back to, you could say, basically pre-car Like that's the definition of urbanity, is something that can work pre-car. But
Yeah.
to follow up on what Mohammed was saying, this idea of who plans the space and who is responsible for it, I think this is one of the things that I find most interesting and challenging, I guess. I don't know if I would say, like, the thing with a mall is it's essentially private space that's planned for public use, whereas public space by definition is contested space, and there's a lot of different stakeholders and different ones have different priorities. And so I guess you could say in that sense, there's by definition competing claims over public space, whereas other kinds of space have, whoever is, there are different control mechanisms, but someone can impose their control. How do those 2 points sort of interact in our definition of urbanity? And yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. I think that's basically.
That's a great question, and one of the things I always try to say, and you're kind of hinting at it, and you hit it actually pretty directly, which is, I don't know that a constructed space can ever be, at least especially a constructed controlled space. Mall is a perfect example, but can ever be fully urban in this thing. I think it can simulate urbanity. I think it can get close, but I don't think it'll ever have that, or at least, not as long as the control structures are so direct and so overwhelming. You make a perfect point. Urban space is contested space. It is it is both a product of and simply the amount, it simply exists as the sum of different people doing their thing in space and in places. So yeah, and you know, the key, what I like to, when I think of how to use urbanity with this, what I think of is, how do we create the structures, whether regulatory or design or other things, that enable this contestation to go on, enable the emergent systems and emergent functions and emergent different things, whatever form they're going to take. What helps enable them, and enable them in a healthy direction? Because it's very, what we saw in the United States is, it's very easy for these emergent forms for everyone to say, oh, I'm going to rewrite the regulations to push everyone apart and to to segregate people and to all these things. And I mean, on one hand, that is the result of contested political space, but it's not necessarily a great outcome. um, and that's why I come back to ideas like regulations, like I look at the American urban regulation thing, and I often find it is precisely turned on its head. We have zoning that forces separation of uses rather than encouraging mixed use. We have maximum densities rather than minimum densities. We require parking rather than limit parking, things of that nature that greatly impact space. And, I think, and obviously this is a much bigger project, but greater regulatory things that can encourage urban environments and urban spaces can, uh, yeah, yeah, the goal here is to help enable this, is to help preserve and keep going the systems that we know work, and try to put a brake on the other ones. I- I- the fundamental issue you're dealing with when we talk about this is, eh, we see it in places like the new urbanist developments, places like Seaside, Florida, which people might know as the site of the film of the Truman Show. That's a real town that was designed to be urban-like in Florida, And it does have, even on its own, a kind of creepiness to it because of that nature, because it hasn't had the history of contestation. It hasn't had the history of inhabitation. It does a lot of the things physically well, you know, but it sort of lacks in this. And uh, there's all sorts of questions of, you know, is that as good as a new build place can be? And maybe, you know, there's always questions of what's new, but and you know what will happen to it over decades and centuries. But there's also questions of, you know, um, how do we support and nurture places that already exist and help them densify? I always find that to be the end, to improve their urban function, because I really think that's always the most important part. Hope I'm not rambling too much. I hope that helps or answers some of it or speaks to it.
Very much so. Thank you. A
Yeah, of course.
follow-up question. In Anglo-Saxon countries, individual rights tend to prime collective rights, and and I think this is also a huge challenge in a lot of places. You know, who are we planning for, and who? Yeah, I mean, basically, you know, is it the collective that we have a responsibility to, or individual property owners, or often individual car owners?
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
No, yeah,
yeah. So,
it's a huge. Yeah, finish your.
but that's all.
Oh no, yeah, great.
Um,
No, I agree. That's a huge issue, and you also see. I mean, you know, different cities around the world take different things depending on, you know, these kind of really deeply things, cultural, you know, rights of the individual, rights of the person, and like, you know, like any other form of governance, anywhere, anytime, it is balancing these that really matters. And I think, in, as you say, in the Anglophone world, you know, we have a long history of um, preserving individual rights, especially individual property owning rights, above any sort of other collective right. Uh, Even then, I can think of exceptions though too. You know, there's something to be said for something I always, you know, think of is, um, you know, there's you get down to this really interesting philosophical question, you know, how strong is the sort of collective public right to their own public sphere? You know, it's one thing to talk about every building owner. It's another thing to say that, well, you know, but the parts of the building that touch the public are, you know, part of the public realm. Does the public, how much of does it say does the public get? And if you go too far in one direction, you end up with, you know, very restrictive historic districts and the like. And there's a lot to be said for them, but they also really, you know, inhibit any sort of development and change and that sort of thing. You know, in the other direction, say, oh, they have no rights, and then so okay, I can just drop whatever I want anywhere, and that can be generative in the short term. It can also be incredibly disruptive and destructive. So, yeah. Um, you know, it's a hard balancing act, and you see it, you know, in different cities across the world and how they're shaped. And you know, I always think finding that balance is always the difficult part of any sort of urban governance or even urban activism, urban anything. And that's why I actually find this framework really helpful, because, you know, when I look at what someone is asking, you know, I can ask, does this inhibit or does it encourage urban function, or is it, you know, orthogonal to both? And, you know, a lot of times, like, you know, the individual car owner, yeah, of course they want to drive and park everywhere, but that is, you know, orthogonal to that is, excuse me, antithetical to urban function. And we, you know, we have to actually have a thing to say, nah, it's the greater, you know, the greater entity that is the city has the right to go against it. Conversely, you know, uh, it's very important for people to feel safe in space. It's very important, you know, you know, if people don't feel safe in space, they're not going to use it. They're not going to be there. They're not going to inhabit it. They're not going to change it. They're not going to do any of the things that make cities cities. But if you go too far in that direction, you start to say, well, we can't have these people protest here because they're disrupting space, or we can't have this here because and then that's too much of I think we could all agree that most of us would agree that's a really strong inhibition on individual rights and the especially individual rights of what Nancy Fraser would call subaltern counterpublics to their right to protest and the like. So yeah, it's a balancing act. And that's, why I like this lens to look at it at all the different levels. And look at the chat real brief because I didn't. Yeah, people just reading what Mohammed said about some people are silent and some people are a pain in the neck and they don't know what they want, and this is really the issue. How it's a huge thing if you are in a space to control this. I do fundamentally believe there is something to be said for that kind of very modern planning thing that you know people who live in a space every day understand it, or at least have an intuitive understanding of it in ways that is very hard for someone who doesn't have that experience to understand. Conversely, though, a lot of times they don't know how to not just operationalize that, but to even sum it up, because they know it intuitively, but they might not know the parts that are really working, the parts that are really, and it's balancing that. It is balancing all of that. I mean, to go back to what Divi said, I hope I pronounced that right, but is um, you know, public space, urban spaces, contested space, um, and to do it right, it has to be, even the contestation has to be the right level of contestation. Too much contestation causes people to retreat. People cannot be fighting all the time. People cannot be defending their existence all the time. Conversely, you know, if it's controlled and completely out of their hands, it dies and falls flat. So, yeah, this is a great conversation. I'd love, if anyone else has thoughts or questions or, I mean, anything. This is going really well, I think. Anyone, anything? I'd love to, I can keep talking. I do enjoy talking, as you might have figured this out, but um, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Annika. Annika just pointed out, but this is good. I should talk a bit about what I do too before we finish. But yes, you know, um, I as she said, I view my job as urban critical analysis. And most if you're interested in this stuff, this is exactly the type of thing I try to weave into and out of my work, mostly through my writing. And you can find my writing, and I'll put it in the chat, but at thefoxinthecity.com. And that is my uh, that is where I put my heart and soul into. Indeed, this whole presentation is based on a older piece there that sort of outlined, my views and thoughts, and goes into a little more depth. It's on the older side now, but it's good. But um, I love to look at spaces, try to analyze them, see where they came from. Do they work? Do they not work? Through this lens of urban function, which I think is something that, for as fundamental as it is often overlooked. People are worried about architecture. They're worried solely about economics. They're worried solely about social equity. And I do not want to say any of these are unimportant, because they're obviously each incredibly important. And I think it's just as important to talk about how does this all come together to support and to or inhibit urban function in a space, and different types of people living their lives, and does it help or inhibit, does it, and how. And so this is what I do. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at Fox and City, where I also share more, low key, as you do on social media, pictures and thoughts of this nature. So I encourage you all, if you found this interesting, I hope you will check it out, because that is what I do, and that is where this goes. So thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate this, and I really appreciate this opportunity, and I really appreciate this discussion. This is great. And if anyone has any other questions or wants to talk, you could find my email address on the website, or you could find me on social media. And, I'd love to keep this conversation going, because I think it is so important, and I think it is so under discussed. So thanks, everybody. And I will call it there, and we'll, hopefully there will be a recording of this at some point. And yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Thank